So I'm currently rewatching The Flash, and after I finished Season 1, I ranked every episode of that season, and I did the same thing with Season 2 as well. You can check out those videos in the top right corner of this one, but now that I'm done with Season 3, I'm going to be doing the same thing for that season. In this video, I'll go over all 23 episodes of Season 3, rank them from worst to best, I'll give a short review for each episode, and when I'm done with the review, you'll see the score that I give out of 10 for each individual episode. So with that out of the way, let's begin the list with the worst episode of the season.
Yeah, pretty cool, right?
We're looking for a meta with super strength.
My daughter, Jesse, quick.
Guys, this thing's coming down.
Run, Jesse.
So episode 3 was definitely not good at all. This episode had a pretty bad villain in Frankie Kane, aka Magenta, and while Jesse Quick's origin story in this episode is pretty cool, that's really all the episode has going for it. Everything else in the episode is pretty annoying, and definitely is, I think, the worst point of the season. It's the part of the season that I just felt like there was literally nothing in the season that I liked. Now this season overall, I actually think it was better than I remembered, but this is the part of the season that I completely dislike, which is why I'll find a lot of the first couple episodes of the season very low on the list.
As to why I'm here.
There's something about him.
Come on, you can't just go through his stuff.
Is trust not something that you have on this earth?
Episode 5 was another point of the season that I just felt like there was nothing going on that I really wanted to see. The villain of this episode, this unnamed teenage boy who created a holographic monster, has got to be one of the most underwhelming villains of the show, not to mention that the actual monster, the CGI used for the monster, is such a waste of CGI. They could have went to a much more interesting character. Maybe this could have been a King Shark or Gorilla Grodd episode, even though the season did have those. I mean, this monster character, it's such a waste of CGI. The one thing I do like about the episode is the Killer Frost storyline, which is the only reason it's higher than Magenta. I guess I like the Killer Frost storyline more than the Jesse Quick storyline in episode 3, but still, definitely a low point for the season.
Good luck getting him out.
Barry!
I'm stuck in a mirror. What are you doing?
Do these pants make my butt look big?
Episode 4 is definitely a part of that season low, the beginning of the season that was just not good, and the only reason this episode is higher than episodes 5 and 3 is because it had both of the storylines that were the only good parts of episodes 3 and 5, which were the Jesse Quick storyline and the Killer Frost storyline, which both of those were in this episode, and that's the only reason it's higher. I mean, the villains of this episode are some of the most disappointing villains on The Flash ever. Mirror Master is probably the most disappointing villain on The Flash ever, while the Top is fairly disappointing as well, as they're just not good. This episode, I think, is just a little bit better than episodes 5 or 3, but still, definitely a part of the beginning of the season that was just so boring.
Ripped up for us. I was thinking Flashpoint.
Speaking of disappointment, Flashpoint has gotta be the most disappointing episode of the show, and I would say the second most disappointing episode of the entirety of the Arrowverse, right after episode 1 of season 6 of Arrow. This episode is so damn disappointing. When Barry went back to save his mother in the ending of season 2, I was so hyped, because Flashpoint, the Flashpoint Paradox, is such a great storyline, probably the best Flash storyline ever, and at that point definitely was my favorite, so I was so excited to see it, and what we got was a pale comparison of the original comic book. I didn't want to see a shot-for-shot remake. I think they should have Arrowvised it, as in, instead of Thomas Wayne using Robert Queen, instead of a war between the Amazonians and the Themyscirians, have like a nuclear war that is destroying the world. Instead, what they went with was a slightly altered reality where Wally West is the Flash, and that's really the only huge difference. It's such a disappointing thing they did there. Also, Flashpoint should have been like 5 episodes, not only 1 episode, so as a whole, it's not the worst episode of the season, but it is by far the most disappointing, as Flashpoint should have been the best storyline that the show has ever done, or at least one of. Instead, it's a 1 episode thing that is really there just to have the rest of the season be the consequences of that episode, which I think is just so lame.
Free. Ever the hero, huh, Barry?
Not learning your lesson, Barry.
Leave while you still can.
Episode 16 of Season 3 is definitely very similar in a lot of ways to Episode 21 of Season 2, as Barry goes into the Speed Force for some reason or another, although in this season it's just not handled as well. The returning characters which represent the Speed Force, like Ronnie Raymond, Eddie Thawne, and Captain Cold, all these dead characters, they should have had some emotion there, but there really wasn't any at all, and this episode only really serves to replace Wally West with Jay Garrick in the Speed Force prison, and while I do like parts of this episode, I think visually it looks really cool, and Black Flash is really cool in this episode as well. Overall, definitely nowhere near my favorite episode of the season at all.
It's a hero right now, Wally. We can prove that we can alter the future here and now.
Concentrate on the exact date in the future that you travel to.
3, 2, 1.
Looking at episode 10, it really represents the season very well because it's all about Barry telling Team Flash about what he saw in episode 9 and then trying to prevent the future. That's really the main storyline of this season, and while I think overall it was actually not a bad storyline at all, in this episode it was pretty good, not great, but also not bad either. I think this episode is overall an okay episode that I was pretty okay with, and I just don't think it did really anything special aside from some cool moments here or there.
See you then.
She's gonna kill me, isn't she? You just need a little practice. Facing the wrong way again. What are my chances here? Scale 1 to 10.
Episode 11 was a pretty fun episode that didn't really contribute to the storyline of the season very much. This episode did introduce Gypsy, or at least kind of introduce Gypsy. Episode 10 was really the episode where she was introduced, but this episode, it really introduced her to us, like, told us who she is and things, and that was actually a pretty good introduction to the character. I do like the fight between Gypsy and Vibe, and while this episode definitely isn't amazing or anything, I think overall it is fun enough to be a fairly good episode.
It wouldn't walk because you did.
The next time you're out there and you're alone, you will win.
Too late, Kid Flash.
I wasn't fast enough.
This episode's main focus was on Kid Flash, and I think because of that it was really good. I mean, it started with a great race between the Flash and Kid Flash, which was a lot of fun, and we saw Wally West learn how to phase, which was also pretty cool. I mean, overall, this was a very good Kid Flash episode. There were some problems here or there, like Iris West being touched by the untouchable guy, Clive Yorkin, which didn't really have any tension because we knew that she wasn't going to die, but I think everything else in this episode, or at least most of what happened in this episode, along with everything that happened with Kid Flash, was actually pretty cool.
Everybody likes pudding.
I screwed up everybody's life.
Now you want to be there for me, just trying to understand.
You need to tell me what is going on, Barry, right now.
While the storyline of the first 5 episodes of the season was very boring and there was really nothing there, episode 2 managed to be actually pretty good in spite of that. This episode saw Barry learning all of the differences about the universe, which aren't as significant as they should be, but still, I do really like what they did here with that, and also the talks between Jay Garrick and Barry Allen about how the timeline can never really fully be restored. That was really, really good. Some great dialogue there. So overall, while the first 5 episodes were terrible, or at least not very good, episode 2 managed to, in spite of that, actually be fairly decent.
You get to go home.
Stick to the script.
Although I should mention, if you die in here, you die out there.
I miss being bulletproof.
So I'll probably catch some flack for putting Duet here on the list instead of or all the way at the bottom, but honestly, looking back on the show, it's really not that bad. Now, I don't really want to see a musical episode on The Flash at all, but aside from the musical part, which isn't terrible, it's just not something I wanted to see, this episode is kind of fun. I think the reason I didn't like it originally, or at least a big reason, was because it came out the same week as one of the most intense episodes of Arrow ever, which is Capuchon, and in contrast, Duet looked pretty bad, like really bad, and I think that's partially why I didn't like it very much. But looking at The Flash individually, I think it was actually pretty good, and a fairly fun crossover with Supergirl with a pretty good villain, and had some really awesome moments where Martian Manhunter teamed up with Team Flash, or at least Kid Flash and Vibe for the first time, which was so cool to see. So overall, while Duet is, I think, the 3rd lowest rated episode of The Flash ever, I honestly think that it isn't even in my top 10 worst episodes, as I think it is actually pretty fun.
Today, I become a god.
Couldn't take this crown, don't need it anymore.
The season finale of the season is very divisive for me. It's got a lot of stupid moments like the HR Irish death switch, but it's also got a lot of great moments like the fight at the end between Savitar and the 3 speedsters on Team Flash, or at least the 3 speedsters that were appearing in that episode, the Flash, Kid Flash, and Jay Garrick. That was an awesome fight, and this episode also had a lot of great moments along with the stupid moments, hence it being not very high on the list, but also not as low as maybe all the other episodes. This episode is definitely not a finale I would say stuck the landing per se, but it is a finale that I thought was good enough to be just not bad.
Grodd's army could be here any second.
Here we go.
This episode is certainly not as good as the first part of the Gorilla Grodd 2-parter, which honestly isn't saying much because I really like this 2-parter. I think it's really, really cool. Like some of the best Grodd stuff that the show has ever had. This episode has some underwhelming moments, and the final fight between Team Flash and Gorilla Grodd isn't really as good as I expected it to be, but overall still a great episode. Some great Gorilla Grodd stuff, like the whole scene with the nuke was actually fairly intense, and the final fight between Grodd and Solivar, not really between the Gorilla and Team Flash, but Grodd and Solivar, that was actually very, very good in terms of the CGI, and watching it was crazy that they actually pulled that off, and they really haven't done anything since on the show, so overall this episode is fairly good.
Lend me a hand.
He has information that will save Iris's life.
I know who Savitar really is.
You shall not!
Episode 18 was her introduction to KADABRA, which honestly it's crazy that this is the only episode they ever used the character, because he is a fairly good villain. I mean, his abilities, where he's from the 64th century and he uses technology that looks like magic, I think it's really interesting. I think he honestly could have made for the main villain of a season. Definitely it wouldn't be my first choice for a main villain, but honestly with his abilities it could have worked. But I actually did like his role in the season-long storyline in this season, teasing Team Flash kind of about Savitar's identity, and even teasing DeVoe in the next season. Abracadabra was a pretty good villain, and this episode overall was a very good episode in my opinion.
Let's do it.
Who are all of you? Oh my lord.
Cisco.
Slight miscalculation.
Where the hell am I? Is this a dentist office?
Episode 21 came out of... Episode 21's concept came at a kind of weird placement in the season. This episode was kind of filler a little bit. It didn't really add to the storyline of the season very much, and it was really just an episode to play around with the concept that Savitar is future Barry, but honestly, I really liked it. I thought that the concept was executed pretty well, with Barry losing his memory because of something that Team Flash has an idea about, but then Savitar losing the same memory. I thought that that was a concept that was actually executed very well, and how they handled Barry losing his memory with Iris seeing him as a more lighthearted version of Barry Allen. I actually really liked it, and I thought this episode was a lot of fun. It's got a lot of funny moments, so while cause and effect, definitely not an awesome episode, not an episode that I would say is amazing, it's still an episode that I think that was a lot of fun.
Well, damn. It's a trap.
Welcome, Flash.
Speedster versus Super Gorilla.
Attack on Gorilla City is, I think, the second best episode of The Flash ever in terms of the visuals. The best, we're going to get to that next season, but this episode looks amazing. The CGI of Gorilla City and Solivar versus Flash, that fight all in broad daylight, it looks amazing, and while this episode's storyline definitely is amazing, I mean, it's pretty good, but not amazing, which is why it's not going to be higher on the list. This episode overall, I think, visually it looks amazing, and because of that, it's enough to make it into the top 10, and also a little bit higher than that.
Possessed.
It's all because I created FLASHPOINT.
You have no idea what's about to begin.
Now, Shade himself was a fairly disappointing villain. I mean, compared to what I've seen before in media, like in Justice League and Justice League Unlimited, or one of the two, I think that here, what we see with Shade, definitely not as good, and definitely not good at all. Shade himself, not a very good villain. The title of this episode is, I think, not a very good title, but the reason I do like the episode is the whole thing with Wally West and his origin story. The one thing I do like about Flashpoint is how it influenced Wally West's origin story, which is a very unique and original origin story, and a lot better than the comics, with the lead up to the confrontation between all these characters and alchemy, and then the debut of Savitar, and with also Wally West being in the cocoon. I think it all worked so well for the episode, and this is really where the season got interesting again. So I remember rewatching it right now, really liking this episode quite a lot.
The wrath of Savitar!
Please tell me you're seeing him.
Oh, I see him.
This mid-season finale was pretty cool. It had some really awesome fight scenes between the Flash and Jay Garrick, and Alchemy and Savitar. I mean, fight scenes that I think visually looked really, really cool. I really liked the storyline of the episode as well, with Team Flash trying to decide what to do with the Philosopher's Stone, and then ending up having to decide to put it in the Speed Force, which we later learned was all a part of Savitar's plan. Also, where we see the beginning of this new storyline where they try to save Iris as Barry sees the future. While that storyline wasn't amazing or anything, it kind of was at the detriment of especially the ending of the season. I do remember really liking this episode, even in this rewatch, as visually it was pretty cool and it had a lot of great moments, and the storyline was, I think, well executed.
Before he even tries.
You are gonna be so surprised when you find out.
You're in for a world of pain.
This was the first time we really got to see the future. I mean, not technically, as we did go a couple months of the future in the episode I just went over in the season finale, but this is the first time in the Arrowverse we really got to see the future for an entire episode, or at least on the Flash and the Flash's future. And sure, it is your typical dark dystopian future. I mean, it wasn't really dystopian, but it is a very dark version of the Flash's future. But however, it was still really cool to see. Mirror Master and the Top are not very good villains, but aside from that, this was a very well executed episode, and seeing the future was very cool. Not to mention that this episode saw the debut of the best costume the CW has ever had, the Flash's Season 4 costume, or what it was originally known as the 2024 costume.
What are you doing? I'm not gonna fight you.
You keep messing with everyone's lives.
Shoot her!
You did this to me. You made me cold-hearted, Mary.
Picking up right where episode 6 left off, this episode saw a fight between the Flash and Savitar, where the Savitar is kind of kicking the crap out of the Flash, which visually looks pretty cool. Definitely not as cool as when Zoom did it, because, I mean, it's been done before, but visually this scene is pretty cool, and this fight is pretty cool. But then Killer Frost steps in, and that's the whole episode, the Flash versus Killer Frost, which I think worked really well. It's a lot of fun, but also it's kind of emotional and very personal for the Flash, and I think Killer Frost could have made for a pretty good main villain, and I think this episode, and also all the build-up to this episode, kind of proves that it really would have worked as a part of the Flashpoint storyline, the consequences of Flashpoint storyline, but also how personal it is between the Flash and Killer Frost, or Team Flash and Killer Frost, and also just the fight scenes. I think this episode proved that Killer Frost as a main villain could have worked, but overall, I really, really like this episode.
Friend, you know how much we love each other, and you know how to use that love against us.
This is all history to him.
I know who you are.
It's about time.
This episode had some pretty cool fights between Killer Frost and Team Flash, as well as between Savitar and Team Flash, and overall it was a pretty good episode until the ending, which revealed Savitar's identity, which I remember originally, it was way too late in the season, but binge watching it now, I think it worked a lot better in terms of the binge watch week to week, as you had to wait 20 episodes, probably that wouldn't work as well, but honestly now binge watching it, I think it actually worked, and this moment where Barry revealed to Savitar that he knows who he is was a really cool moment, like a very, very epic moment that I really, really think was a great identity reveal if you binge watch it. So overall, this episode is one of the best of the season.
Guys. Aliens!
Invasion is probably my second favorite crossover at this point, and this episode, while not being the best of the crossover, is still a lot of fun, and it's really, really good. Seeing all these superheroes team up, especially characters like the Green Arrow, the Flash, Supergirl, and the rest of the Legends, which is a lot better than it was in the last two crossovers in terms of the ensemble of superheroes. I think that was just so cool to see, not to mention that I actually really like how they used the consequences of Flashpoint in this episode, especially how Oliver reacts to that. I think it was really, really cool how they handled that. So overall, Invasion is a great episode.
What I need to escape my hell.
He's 10 steps ahead of you. There's no stopping Savitar.
This episode I thought was such a great episode for Savitar. He was just so menacing and cool in this episode, and how he was manipulating everything, especially with Wally, it worked just so well. The ending especially, where Wally is brought into the Speed Force and then Savitar gets out, and then there's this fight between Savitar and the Flash. It's, I think, really cool. This episode does have a kind of annoying plot line, side plot with Barry and Iris that isn't necessarily great, but literally everything else in this episode is actually great. So overall, The Wrath of Savitar, while definitely not perfect, definitely not as good as I think the second best episode of a season should be, it's still a very good episode that deserves to be higher than all the episodes we've gone over so far.
Thief. It's my kind of mission.
If we don't use this, Iris is going to die tonight.
Can't believe they turned King Shark into a guard dog.
King Shark.
That's adorable.
Now, I do not remember liking this episode as much as I did, but rewatching it now, this episode is, just has got it. Now, I do not remember liking this episode this much, but honestly, looking back now, this episode has got to be the episode that I like the most in this season. It's not a perfect 10 out of 10. This is the first season that the best episode is not a perfect 10 out of 10. It's the first season that doesn't have one, and maybe the only season, but still, this is a very good episode. Bringing Captain Cold back was great. I thought he worked very well in this episode. Everything to do with King Shark was really cool, but it's definitely the ending of the episode that was the best part, as Savitar comes back, gets Iris, and actually goes through the killing, and the way they executed the actual murder of Iris West in this episode, definitely not the next one, but in this actual episode, made it even a little bit emotional. So they really get props for that, because I didn't really think it would be, but with the music in the background, with all the build-up, I think it worked very well. So overall, Infantino Street is the best episode of this season, but I really wouldn't say it's anywhere near the best episode, or even maybe not in the top 10 of the entire show, as Season 3 never really got to the heights of Seasons 1 or 2, or even, spoiler alert, Seasons 4 or 5. So that is my ranking for every episode of The Flash Season 3. Let me know what your ranking is, or at least your top 10 best and top 10 worst episodes, or maybe top 5 best and worst episodes of this season. And if you like this video and you haven't seen the Seasons 1 or 2 videos, definitely check that out in the top right corner of this video. But if you like this video, make sure to leave a like, share, and subscribe, and thanks for watching.